I never told my new wife that the cabin was mine. I let her believe I was just the one who kept it running, fixed the dock in spring, patched the roof before the first snow, called the propane company when the tank ran low. She thought I worked for whoever owned the place. I never corrected her. That was the plan from the beginning. By the time I met her, I was 63 years old and had spent the better part of 4 decades building something quiet, not flashy, not the kind of thing you'd see in a magazine, just solid. A property on Georgian Bay I'd bought in my late 30s when nobody wanted land that far up the road. 2 more parcels near Perry Sound I'd picked up over the years when prices dipped. A modest rental in Sudbury that my son managed on my behalf. I'd paid off the cabin years ago. The rest of it, the accounts, the investments, sat behind a name that didn't lead anywhere obvious. I didn't come from money. My father worked the line at a paper mill in Espanola his whole life. My mother cleaned houses on weekends when they needed the extra. I learned early that you don't talk about what you have, because if you do, people start looking at it like it belongs to them too. My first wife understood that. We were married for 31 years. She passed from a cardiac event in the spring of 2019, on a Tuesday afternoon while I was driving back from town with a bag of groceries. I pulled into the driveway and something already felt wrong before I even got to the door. I don't know how to explain that. I just knew. After that, I spent a long time not being interested in much of anything. My daughter. She lives down in Guelph now with her husband. She started calling more often. My son drove up from Barrie a few weekends a month. They were worried in the way that children worry when a parent goes quiet. I appreciated it even when I didn't say so. I wasn't looking for anyone. I wasn't on any apps. I wasn't asking around. But in the summer of 2023, a mutual acquaintance introduced me to a woman at a charity dinner in Midland. She was 57. She had a way of laughing that reminded me of nobody I'd ever known, which I think is why it worked on me. She was warm and easy to talk to, and she asked me questions like she actually wanted to hear the answers. We started seeing each other in September. By December, she was spending weekends at the cabin. I had told her early on that I was the caretaker. Not in a formal way. I hadn't sat her down and made a speech about it. It came up naturally when she'd asked what I did, and I'd said I looked after a property up on the bay for a family out of Toronto. She accepted that. She didn't push. I made a reasonable wage. I had a decent truck. The cabin was comfortable. It fit together well enough that there was no reason to question it. What I didn't tell her was that the family out of Toronto was my holding company. I know how that sounds. I've thought about it many times since. But I had my reasons, and they weren't small ones. I'd heard enough stories from friends over the years. Men who remarried and found themselves untangling messes they never saw coming. A colleague of mine from the mill, long since retired, had lost half his retirement assets in a second marriage that lasted 14 months. Another man I knew through my son's hockey years had signed a quitclaim deed he hadn't fully understood and spent 3 years in court getting it sorted out. These weren't foolish men. They were just trusting at the wrong moment. I wasn't going to be that, so I watched. And I waited. And I told myself that if she was the right person, she'd be the right person whether I had money or not. We got married in April. Small ceremony at the local municipal office. Just our kids and a couple of close friends. Her son was there, 26, lived in Hamilton, didn't talk much. Her daughter had sent a card. My son shook her hand and smiled at me the way he does when he's uncertain, but trying to be supportive. My daughter hugged her and meant it. It was a good day. I believed it was a good day. 72 hours later, I was under the dock replacing a rusted bracket when I heard a car I didn't recognize come up the gravel drive. I stayed where I was for a moment. Through the gaps in the dock boards I could see her come out of the cabin. She was dressed differently than she'd been at breakfast. Blazer, good shoes. She'd said she was going to spend the morning reading. A man got out of the car. He had a leather portfolio under his arm. She greeted him with the comfortable ease of someone who'd met him before. I eased back under the dock and stayed still. I couldn't hear everything. The water moves up there. There's always wind off the bay. But I caught enough. Frontage footage. Comparable sales in the area. Whether the structure would need updating before listing. The words estate property and lakefront premium. I stayed under that dock for a long time after they went inside. I didn't go in right away. I sat on the end of the dock with my feet hanging over the water, and I thought about what I'd just heard. I thought about how she'd kissed me on the cheek that morning before I came down to work. I thought about the ceremony 3 days ago and the way she'd held my hand at the reception dinner. I thought about what my father would have said. Then I went inside and said nothing. I made coffee. I asked how her morning had been. She said, fine, quiet, she'd read by the window. I nodded and said that sounded nice. That evening I called my son. He's not an excitable person. He got that from his mother. He listened without interrupting while I told him what I'd seen and heard. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "How did she know?" It was the right question. The same one I'd been sitting with all afternoon. She hadn't known. I was sure of that when we met. But she'd had months, and I had a name on a county land registry that wasn't completely disconnected from me, if you knew where to look. The property tax records in Ontario are public, not obvious, not on the surface, but reachable if someone typed the right things into the right databases. My son said he'd make a call to his contact at the law office in Barrie. He said to sit tight and not do anything yet. I said I wasn't going to do anything yet. That was the truth. I'm not a confrontational man by nature. I never have been. My first instinct when something goes wrong isn't to shout, it's to get quiet and think, and make sure I understand the whole shape of the problem before I decide what to do about it. The next morning, she was chatty over breakfast. She talked about wanting to do something to the back porch, maybe get some furniture in for the summer. She asked if I thought the owners, she still called them that, would mind if we made a few changes. I said I'd have to check with them. She said she thought we should start thinking about our own place eventually, somewhere that was really ours. She said it in a light tone, just thinking out loud, but her eyes were watching me when she said it. I said that sounded reasonable and poured myself more coffee. 2 days later, my son called me back. He'd had someone run a background search. Not anything invasive, just what's available. And what came back was something I hadn't expected. She had been married before. Not once. Twice. Her first marriage had ended in a proper divorce in 2009, but her second marriage, a man in Mississauga, had apparently never been legally dissolved. There was no record of a divorce filing, no annulment. The marriage in 2014 appeared to still be on record. If that was accurate, our marriage wasn't a marriage. Not legally. In Canada, a person cannot legally marry while a prior marriage remains valid. It's straightforward. It's not a gray area. I sat with that information for a full day before I decided what to do. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. There was no rage in it, not really. There was something quieter, a kind of tired sadness, the way you feel when something you suspected turns out to be true and you wish it hadn't been. And underneath that, if I'm honest, something that felt a little like relief, not because I wanted her gone, but because the door out of this had opened cleanly without requiring me to be cruel. I called a lawyer in Barrie, one I'd used before for some property work, and explained the situation. She confirmed what my son had found. She said the process would be straightforward given the circumstances. No assets had been commingled. No joint accounts had been opened. The marriage certificate itself was legally void from the moment it was signed. She said I didn't need to do anything dramatic. I've never been interested in dramatic. I gave it 1 more week. During that week, I watched carefully and said nothing and continued to be the same man she'd been eating breakfast with and walking the shore with in the evenings. I needed to know if there was anything else I'd missed, whether her son was involved, whether there were other threads I hadn't pulled yet. Her son called her twice that week. Both times she stepped outside to take the call. Both times she came back in and said it was nothing, just catching up. On the Friday, my daughter drove up from Guelph. I'd asked her to come, told her I needed to talk. She arrived in the afternoon while my wife was out for a walk, and I told her everything at the kitchen table over tea. She's sharp, my daughter. She didn't cry and she didn't make speeches. She put both hands around her mug and looked at me for a while, and then she said, "So what do you need from me?" I said I needed her to be here when I had the conversation, not to intervene, just to be present, as a witness, as family. She said she'd be here. When my wife came back from her walk, she found the two of us at the kitchen table. She smiled and said she hadn't known we were expecting company. My daughter said she'd just stopped by to visit. I asked my wife to sit down. I told her I'd made some calls this week, that I'd done some checking, that I'd found out about the marriage and Mississauga. She went very still. I told her I'd also spoken to the owner of the property, meaning myself, though I didn't say that yet, and that the property was not for sale and had never been for sale and would not be going on the market. Her face did something complicated. It moved through several things quickly: surprise, calculation, something that might have been embarrassment. She started to say that she didn't know what I was talking about, that whoever I'd spoken to had given me wrong information, that she'd only been asking questions. I let her finish. Then I told her about the land registry. I told her I'd been doing the checking myself for quite some time before I made any calls. I explained calmly what a county property record shows and how it can be found. I told her I'd known since the morning under the dock. She was quiet for a long time. My daughter sat next to me and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Finally, my wife asked what I was going to do. I said the marriage had already been reviewed by a lawyer, and that given the existing legal situation, I explained about the prior marriage, there was nothing to undo because there was nothing that had been legally created. She would not be disputing any assets because there was nothing for her to dispute. The cabin was held in a company name. My personal accounts had never been shared. She had no legal claim to anything, and she never had. I told her I'd arranged for a friend of mine to drive her back to her apartment in Midland. Her things could be picked up over the next week. I wasn't going to make it ugly. I wasn't going to involve police unless she gave me a reason to. She asked if I really owned the property. I said yes. She asked, since when? I said since before we met. She looked at me the way people look at someone when they realize they've been playing a game the other person knew about from the beginning. It's not a comfortable look to be on either side of, honestly. She left that afternoon. My daughter stayed for the weekend. We didn't talk about it much after that first conversation. We made dinner together on Saturday night, a roast chicken the way her mother used to make it, and we sat on the back porch after and listened to the loons out on the bay. It was cold enough for jackets. The sky was very clear. She asked me at one point if I was all right. I said I thought I was. She said she'd been worried about me, living up here alone for so long. She said she was glad I'd tried, even if it hadn't worked out the way it was supposed to. I said I'd known since the dock that it wasn't going to work out. I said the harder part was accepting that I'd wanted it to. She didn't say anything to that. She just put her hand on my arm for a moment, and then we went back to watching the water. My son called the following week to check in. He asked the same question his sister had. I gave him the same answer. The lawyer in Barrie filed the necessary paperwork to have the situation formally documented, not a divorce, because there was no valid marriage to dissolve, but a declaration of nullity. It cost me less than a week's worth of property taxes and was over before the ice went out on the bay. I still get up early. I still walk the shore before breakfast. I still fix what needs fixing. and check the dock lines, and watch the sky go pink over the water in the morning, when the light is good. I spent the summer doing what I always do up here. Painted the boathouse in July. Had my son and his family up for 2 weeks in August. My granddaughter caught her first bass off the dock and screamed loud enough to startle every bird on the property, and I laughed harder than I had in a long time. I'm not angry. I'm not sure I ever was, not in the sustained way some people are after something like this. What I am is clear. Clearer than I've been in a while, maybe. I learned a long time ago that you can't protect yourself from wanting something. You're going to want things. You're going to hope. That's not the part you control. What you can control is how carefully you watch and how long you're willing to wait before you believe what you're seeing. I was careful. And in the end, careful was enough. The loons are back this spring. They came in on a Wednesday evening, same as they usually do, and I heard them out on the water before I saw them. I poured a coffee and took it out to the dock and stood there until it was too dark to see much of anything. It was a good night. I've been sitting with this for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually cost me and what it didn't. There's a version of this story where I come out looking clever. Man outsmarts scheming wife, keeps his property, walks away clean. I've seen people tell it that way, and I understand the appeal. But that's not quite how it felt from the inside. What I felt, mostly, was tired. Not bitter tired. Just the kind of tired that comes from wanting something to be true badly enough that you look past the things that don't quite add up. I wanted her to be who she seemed to be in the beginning. That wanting was genuine. And I think that matters, not as an excuse, but as an honest accounting of what happened. I wasn't careless, I was hopeful. There's a difference, even if the outcome looks the same from the outside. What kept me from losing everything wasn't luck. It was a habit I built over 60-plus years of paying attention. My father taught me that without ever using the word. He'd fix something, and then he'd stand back and look at it, and then he'd check it again, not because he didn't trust his own work, because he understood that the cost of being wrong was higher than the cost of checking twice. That's not cynicism. That's just being responsible to yourself and the people who depend on you. I checked twice. I watched carefully before I acted. And when I found out the truth, not just about the lawyer she called, but about the marriage in Mississauga, I didn't blow it up. I handled it the way you handle a structural problem in an old building, methodically, without making it worse than it already was. My son was steady through all of it. My daughter drove 4 hours to sit beside me at a kitchen table, so I wouldn't have to have that conversation alone. I think about that a lot. The people who showed up, that's what you actually build over a lifetime. Not the properties, not the accounts, but the relationships that hold when something goes sideways. If I have any honest advice to offer anyone who finds themselves in a similar place, whether you're thinking about remarrying late in life or just trying to figure out who to trust after a loss, it's this. Integrity starts with the small decisions, the ones nobody's watching. I kept the cabin in a company name not because I was devious, but because I'd seen what happens when people aren't careful. That carefulness protected me. But it also protected her from a situation that would have been worse for everyone if I'd been naive about it. The willingness to keep thinking clearly when your heart is pulling in a different direction. That's harder than it sounds. It takes something. Not toughness exactly. More like discipline. The kind that comes from accepting that your judgment is a tool you have to maintain, even when you'd rather just trust and let go. I still live at the cabin. The bay is the same as it's always been. The loons came back this spring, same as every year. Some things hold. You just have to know which ones.